Marguerite of Navarre was found unconscious in her cell. Servants recalled that she smelled of rot and stale laundry, and there was dried blood on her lips. That evening, the monastery gates were closed earlier than usual, and no outsiders were allowed in. According to witnesses, there were signs of men having been in her room: a dropped ring, a strip of embroidered fabric, and dirty boot prints on the stone slabs. Rumors of the fall of the royal nun spread faster than the first bell rang for morning service. By this time, her body was already showing signs of a long illness. According to one of the doctors, her tongue was covered with a grey coating. Her breath was foul, her eyes were cloudy, and her urine was dark in colour. The first bloodletting was performed at dawn by opening a vein in her left arm. The blood was thick, with dark clots. On the doctor's orders, the procedure was repeated twice a day in small portions. 6 leeches were placed on her thigh and abdomen, holding them for no more than a quarter of an hour. Cauterization was performed on the festering ulcers, but the wounds only swelled and exuded a foul odor. Ointments made from lard, vinegar, and crushed garlic were applied to the skin 3 times a day, with the dressings changed every 2 hours. The doctors noted in their records, the pulse is weak, the tongue is trembling, the urine smells strong, and the sweat is sour. The servants said that her linen was changed daily, but it quickly took on the smell of urine and rotting sores. The felt pads placed under her body were soaked with sweat and blood. Straps on the bed held her in place so that during her delirious episodes she would not tear off the bandages and fall onto the stone floor. The doctor recommended giving her a pinch of opium powder at dawn and 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup at night to help her sleep. But even with this medicine, Margarita woke up, cried out about her sins, and whispered the names of the men she had tried to hide from her confessor. Access to her chambers was strictly restricted. The keys were kept by the abbot of the convent, but the guards at the doors were replaced by people from various noble families, which gave rise to suspicion and quarrels. Some believed that it was necessary to draw up a will in favor of the old nobility, while others demanded that influence be transferred to the new court circle. Reports said that secret meetings were held in the corridors at night, and the sick woman's food and wine cups were checked for poison, forcing the servants to taste them first. Once, the seals on a chest of medicines were found to have been replaced, and the doctor claimed that some of the vials of tinctures had been replaced. The religious line became increasingly harsh. Every day she was confessed by an appointed priest. He demanded confession of mortal sins and reminded her of her vows and promises of alms. In her delirium, she would agree, then refuse. The records of one witness have been preserved. She cried out that the Lord would not forgive her, for her flesh was rotting not only in body, but also in spirit. Then she fell unconscious. Around her illness, there were arguments about the fate of the executed heretics. Some demanded new executions to atone for her sins, others demanded clemency, hoping for God's mercy. As her condition worsened, rumors about her secret relationships intensified. Reports mentioned that hidden letters with men's names had been found in the monastery, and other lists had been destroyed. Old chroniclers wrote that one of the knights tried to sneak into her chambers through a secret passage, but was caught and questioned. This info got mixed up with political struggles. Some nobles wanted to use her weakness to strengthen their power, while others wanted to weaken their rivals. Margarita was still able to give orders. She demanded that her cell be aired 3 times a day. but the windows were only opened for an hour, as the stench spread throughout the monastery. The servants were afraid to come near her. Her skin was covered with sores that oozed a yellow liquid, and the smell was unbearable. Doctors noted new symptoms: swollen legs, cracks in her heels, bloody scabs on her wounds, and convulsions in her hands. Despite this, her words carried weight. She signed orders, even though her hand was shaking and the letters were becoming illegible. Her signatures were sometimes forged, which added to the confusion. Some claimed that the will had already been drawn up in favor of the new party, while others claimed that it had been falsified. Secret meetings took place under cover of night, and rumors of an impending coup grew stronger every day. Contemporaries described the first part of her protracted decline as a series of unrelenting torments. She was still alive and dangerous to her enemies, but her body had already begun to break down. Doctors wrote dryly, "The fever does not subside. Sweating is incessant. Breathing is difficult." Servants whispered, "She is rotting, but still holds power." A heavy smell of illness hung in her chambers, and she herself lay tied with straps, between bouts of consciousness and delirium, still clutching in her hands the weak threads of power that were turning into the object of other people's intrigues with each passing day. Marguerite of Navarre could no longer rise from her bed. The servants recalled that her body had become immobile, and any touch caused her to cry out in agony. The doctors noted, "Her pulse is weak and irregular, her tongue is covered with ulcers, and her breathing is heavy and foul-smelling." Flakes appeared in her urine, which turned almost black. New abscesses opened on her body. Pus oozed through the bandages, and her underwear had to be changed twice a day. The bleeding continued, but now no more than once a day, in small amounts so as not to deprive her of her last strength. Leeches were placed on her lower back and behind her ears and left for a quarter of an hour. Cauterization was no longer used for treatment, but to stop the spreading gangrene. Ointments made from lard, vinegar, and crushed garlic did not help. The skin darkened and began to peel off. The doctors added new remedies. Compresses made from wormwood and resin changed every half hour. In the mornings, she was given tiny doses of opium powder, and at night, 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup. Even under their influence, she did not sleep, tossing and turning and whispering as if talking to invisible people. The smell in her chambers became so bad that the guards at the door were changed more often, every 2 hours. The windows were only opened for a short time, otherwise the air in the monastery became unbearable. The servants complained of nausea and vomiting after spending even a short time at her bedside. The rags placed under her body were stained with yellow spots mixed with blood and pus. At night, her moans could be heard through the walls, and the monastery was filled with anxiety. Meanwhile, the struggle for her inheritance intensified. Supporters of the old nobility sought access to her in order to record her last will and testament. Her new entourage, on the contrary, isolated her chambers. Only 2 confidants and the abbot had access, and the keys were kept by the treasurer. The guards were reinforced, and double posts were set up in the corridors. Rumors claimed that an attempt had been made to pass off a forged document as a will, but it had been seized in time. Ambassadors from neighboring powers awaited her death and urged their allies to act. According to reports, secret conversations were held to discuss possible intervention if power passed to her opponents. Inside the monastery, there were disputes about the clergy's right to interfere in her affairs. Some believed that she should leave her property to the church, while others believed that power should pass to secular rulers. Her confessions became increasingly difficult. The priest wrote, "She refuses to believe in forgiveness, throws hysterical fits, and calls out the names of those who are said to be her secret lovers. Sometimes she begged to be allowed to die in peace. Sometimes she demanded that those guilty of her downfall be executed. These words became weapons for intrigue. Informers spread them around the court, attributing guilt to one side or the other. Her physical condition deteriorated, her eyes clouded over, her vision almost disappeared, and her face was covered with sores. Her legs swelled to such an extent that the skin cracked and bled. Servants said that she sometimes tried to stand up, but fell down and was tied back to her bed with straps. The smell became unbearable, and doctors noted she has a constant fever, her sweat is bitter, and her breath is foul. During these weeks, her signatures became increasingly illegible. Some claimed that it was at this time that her true will was drawn up, while others claimed that all the documents were forged. Rumors circulated that the ink on the paper had dried before she even touched it. Despite her terrible condition, her name continued to hold power. In the corridors of the monastery, people said, "She is rotting, but her word still rules." The fear of her decisions was stronger than the fear of death itself. People entered her chambers with disgust, but left trembling, because even half dead, she could strip them of their land and titles. By the end of the second phase of her illness, Marguerite was almost no longer herself. She was torn between delirium and brief flashes of consciousness. Her body was falling apart, but power was still the subject of struggle. Everything around her was preparing for the inevitable outcome, but she herself, disfigured by illness, was still alive and continued to keep everyone in fear. Servants and guards said that it was impossible to stay in her chambers at night. Marguerite screamed, struggled against her restraints, and demanded to see people who had long since passed away. Her voice broke into prayers, then turned into a hoarse whisper in which curses could be heard. Doctors noted, consciousness is clouded, speech is incoherent, eyes are cloudy, pupils do not react to light. Ulcers spread across her body, and black spots appeared on her skin, indicating the onset of gangrene. The doctors who took turns at her bedside increasingly noted her despair. Her pulse was barely discernible, her breathing was intermittent, and the smell from her mouth was unbearable. Bloodletting was now limited to once a week. The blood was foul-smelling and clotted, and the doctors feared that she would die during the procedure. Leeches were placed on her neck and temples, but her skin swelled up, and they often failed to attach. Vinegar and garlic ointments were replaced with stronger mixtures: resin, wormwood, and oil. The bandages were changed every 2 hours, but the wounds only grew larger. At night, she was given grains of opium, and at dawn, 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup. But even with this, she did not sleep, muttering that she saw demons at her bedside. Those around her increasingly argued about whether to continue treatment at all. Some said that God was punishing her for her sins. Others that she might still survive and regain power. At this time, secret meetings in the corridors of the monastery intensified. The old nobles demanded access to her signature to secure the rights of her heirs. Her new entourage kept her isolated, allowing only the treasurer and 2 trusted guards to enter. There were several attempts to break into her chambers. According to reports, one night, the list of people allowed to see her was replaced, and a man disguised as a doctor tried to enter her cell. He was detained, but the names of those who had ordered the attack were concealed. Guards with different surnames almost came to blows right at the door. The keys to the chambers were kept by the abbot, but it was rumored that the new courtiers had their own secret duplicate. Ambassadors of foreign powers openly discussed her imminent death in their letters. Reports noted, if she dies without a will, war will break out between the parties. If the will is forged, no one will recognize it. People at court were already dividing up her lands, even though she was still alive. Her confessions became a subject of controversy. A priest wrote, she confesses her sins, but then recants, saying that she has no remorse and does not repent. Sometimes she demanded that specific people be executed, calling them responsible for her downfall. And sometimes she begged for mercy. Rumors of her words spread quickly, becoming a weapon against her enemies. Her physical condition deteriorated rapidly. Her legs turned black and her skin began to peel. Cracks appeared on her feet, oozing blood. Servants were forced to wrap them in rags to hide the sight and smell. She lost her sight almost completely, but sometimes she opened her eyes and spoke as if she could see shadows standing by her bed. The doctors recorded constant sweating, wheezing, difficulty urinating, cracked tongue. Every visit to her bed was accompanied by a stench that made even the doctors, who were used to illness, hold their noses. The guards complained of nausea and asked to change shifts more often. By this time, her signature was almost impossible to read. Her hand was shaking, and the letters were blurred. Rumor had it that an attempt was made to completely forge her will. Some claimed that she herself dictated the terms in her delirium, while others said that all the documents were written by someone else. Despite the decomposition of her body and the loss of her mind, she still inspired fear. The servants whispered, she is blind, but she hears everything. She is dying, but she can still destroy us. Her name still held power, and therefore her every breath became a cause for intrigue. By the end of this period, Marguerite had almost lost her human form. But it was then that the struggle around her bed reached its peak. Every word she uttered in her delirium became a political argument. Her every movement was interpreted as a sign. She was alive, but her life was no longer her own. It was a battlefield between families, parties, and powers, ready to engage in open conflict. Marguerite could no longer sit or hold a pen. Her body had completely lost its strength, and even in her brief moments of lucidity, she could only move her lips, and her words came out as a barely audible wheeze. The doctors noted, her tongue is dry and cracked, she has almost no urine, her breathing is labored, and her pulse is weak. The smell from her chambers spread throughout the entire corridor. The servants no longer wanted to change her bandages. Ulcers covered her stomach, chest, and shoulders. Pus seeped through any fabric, and the smell was so pungent that herbs were constantly burned in the monastery to mask it even slightly. The procedures were now reduced to symbolic gestures. Bloodletting once a week in small portions, 6 leeches on her temples or thighs, which often simply fell off, unable to withstand the stench. Cauterization was stopped. The skin around the ulcers darkened and peeled off. The doctors noted, the skin is earthy in color, with black spots on the legs and a cadaverous odor. She was still given opium grains in the morning and 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup at night, but she no longer slept. only random mutterings and cries. The guards at her door changed noticeably. The old family no longer sought constant access. They knew that the end was near and were betting not on her signature, but on forgery. Only 2 servants and 1 doctor were allowed into her chambers. Even the abbot rarely appeared, and then only for confession, which Margarita could no longer utter properly. She whispered fragments of phrases: sin, execute, forgive, and no one could understand to whom they were addressed. Those around him gradually turned away. Rumors about the will multiplied. They said that the real document was hidden in the treasurer's chest, and that the one shown by those close to him was a forgery. It was also claimed that one night, servants saw papers with seals being copied by candlelight in a neighboring cell. No one trusted Margarita's words, the documents, or even the doctor's testimony anymore. The feud between the parties intensified. Night patrols with torches were organized in the corridors of the monastery, and guards stood watch at the gates. Ambassadors from neighboring states began to openly interfere. One demanded the recognition of an heir from the old nobility. Another offered support for the new entourage. Reports noted, the lady's death is near, and each side is ready to assert its rights at the same moment. Margarita herself was almost unaware of what was happening during those days. Her eyes were completely clouded over, and her pupils did not respond. Doctors wrote, "She is unconscious, her body is motionless, and her breathing is labored." The servants claimed that she sometimes opened her mouth and moaned, but it was unclear whether there was still any life in her body. Buckets of water and rags were always kept in her chambers to wash away the pus and blood, but the smell remained unbearable. She still inspired fear. Even in this condition, no one dared to declare her dead prematurely. It was said that a single word from her could turn the tide of battle. And so every time she raised her head and wheezed something unintelligible, the servants ran to the corridor, spreading rumors of her new orders. By this time, her name had become nothing more than a ghost of power. She no longer ruled, signed documents, or punished anyone. But the struggle around her bed continued to destroy the monastery and tear the nobility apart. Some said that her death would bring peace, others that chaos would ensue. She lay in the darkness, in her foul-smelling chambers, no longer resembling a human being. Her body was rotting, her eyesight was gone, and her hands were disfigured by ulcers. But fear still lingered, and everyone waited for the moment when it would disappear with her last breath. Marguerite of Navarre died at dawn. The servant on duty at her bedside wrote, "She wheezed like a blacksmith's bellows, then her mouth opened slightly, her eyes remained cloudy and open, and her breathing stopped." The doctors checked her pulse and breathing for another 2 hours before declaring her dead. By this time, her body had already begun to emit a strong, cadaverous odor, and her linen, soaked in pus and blood, had to be burned immediately. Carrying the body out of the chambers turned into a humiliating ritual. The servants, wrapping her in a coarse cloth, complained that her skin was separating from her bones. One of them later said, "When we lifted her, her arms and legs seemed to be floating." A heavy odor spread through the corridors of the monastery, and the guards covered their faces with cloth. Serious difficulties arose with embalming. Doctors noted, "The body is decomposed, the organs are in a state of decay, and the intestines are emitting a foul odor. A mixture of vinegar, resin, and herbs could not mask the smell." The autopsy revealed that the liver had almost disintegrated, the lungs were blackened, and the heart was flaccid. The surface of the skin was already peeling off in places. Servants struggled to wash the remains, changing the water every quarter of an hour. A small circle of nobles demanded a quick burial, fearing unrest. But new courtiers wanted to put the body on display for veneration in order to secure their rights. This caused a quarrel right at the gates of the monastery. Guards from different families grabbed their weapons, and only the intervention of the abbot prevented a massacre. News of her death spread instantly. A crowd gathered at the monastery walls. Some said that God had punished her for her secret sins, others that she had been killed to seize power. Rumors circulated among the monks that in her last days she had seen demons and refused to repent. Envoys from neighboring countries immediately sent reports to their capitals. Some suggested immediate intervention. Others supported the new nobility who had seized access to the will. The old nobles claimed that the document was forged. The treasurer disappeared that same night, along with the chest containing the seals and papers. The funeral took place in a tense atmosphere. The body was carried quickly, covered with several layers of cloth, because the smell was unbearable. The servants could barely hold the stretcher, fearing that the remains would begin to decay before their eyes. Monastic chroniclers recorded there was no grandeur, only fear and stench. The consequences of her death were devastating. Old families entered into open conflict with the new entourage, accusing each other of forging the will. Some of the land was seized by force. Some went to the church. The people, who had witnessed the disgraceful end of the royal nun, spoke of divine punishment and lost trust in the promises of the nobility. Foreign courts discussed the possibility of dividing her estates, and the first mercenary troops were already gathering at the border. Thus ended the life of a woman who had once influenced destinies. She died in a decaying body, leaving behind not order but chaos, in which power passed to those who had been closest to her bed in her final days. The chronicles wrote, "She ruled by fear and died in fear." After her, there was emptiness, in which everyone sought to grab their share.